Hello there, my Twilight souls. Tonight, we journey with Bella Swan, the ordinary girl who walked into extraordinary darkness and chose it willingly. The daughter who sacrificed sun and warmth for her father's quiet loneliness, and a love that would consume her mortality entirely. She is the girl who fell in love with a vampire and never looked back, who chose forever over safety, who walked toward death with open eyes and called it destiny. So, before you get cozy, I want to tell you something small and honest. I have this dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers before the month ends. If you've been enjoying these stories and you'd like to help me get there, subscribing would mean so much. Now, let's ease into a peaceful moment together and let Bella's human existence carry you softly into rest. Phoenix, Arizona. In the late 1980s and through the 1990s, was a city of endless sun and sprawling desert. A place where the heat baked everything into submission, and the sky stretched wide and blue and relentless overhead, where winter meant 70 degrees and sweaters were decorative rather than functional, where the landscape was all sand and scrub, and the particular hardy plants that could survive when water was scarce and the sun was an enemy to anything soft or vulnerable. It was a world of strip malls and tract housing, of swimming pools in every backyard and air conditioning running constantly from April through October, of that peculiar southwestern aesthetic that mixed Spanish colonial revival with mid-century ranch houses and called it architecture, of a city growing too fast and spreading too far across desert that had never been meant to support so many people demanding so much water. Isabella Marie Swan was born on September 13th, 1987 in Forks, Washington, though she would have no memory of that green wet place of her birth, her parents' marriage already fracturing under the weight of their fundamental incompatibility even as her mother held her hours-old body in the hospital room. Her father, Charlie Swan, was the chief of police in that tiny logging town, a man of few words and deep silences, someone whose love expressed itself through actions rather than declarations, whose discomfort with emotion and conversation made him seem distant even when his devotion was absolute and unwavering. Her mother, Renee, was his opposite in every way that mattered, a free spirit who moved through life following impulses and intuitions rather than plans or practicality, an artistic soul who started projects with enormous enthusiasm and abandoned them halfway through when something new and shiny caught her attention, a woman who needed constant stimulation and change and excitement in ways that small-town life could never satisfy or accommodate. The divorce happened when Bella was only 6 months old, too young to remember her parents together, too young to have any sense of what an intact family might feel like or what had been lost, when Renee packed their belongings and moved them away from the Olympic Peninsula's endless rain to Phoenix's endless sun. Renee got custody without contest, Charlie understanding that he could not give a baby what she needed, that his work schedule and his quiet nature and his complete lack of maternal instinct made him unsuitable as primary parent, that letting them go was the loving choice, even though it meant his daughter would grow up knowing him only through summer visits and occasional phone calls that grew more awkward as the years accumulated between them. Bella grew up in Phoenix with a mother who loved her desperately, but who was fundamentally unsuited to the practical demands of parenthood, who forgot to pay bills and burn dinner, and made impulsive decisions that created chaos in their small apartment or whatever rental house they were occupying during that particular phase of Renee's ever-changing enthusiasms and employment situations. Renee moved between jobs with alarming frequency. Her artistic temperament and her difficulty with authority making long-term employment nearly impossible. Her genuine talents never quite translating into stable income or career trajectory. She took up painting and then pottery and then jewelry making and then photography. Each new passion consuming her completely for months before fading into something she never mentioned again. The supplies and equipment gathering dust in closets or being donated to thrift stores when they moved to yet another rental that Renee believed would be the fresh start they needed. The role reversal happened gradually and then completely. Bella, learning before she was 10 years old that if she wanted regular meals and clean clothes and homework completed on time, she would need to manage these things herself because her mother could not be relied upon to remember such mundane necessities when she was caught up in her latest enthusiasm or struggling through her latest disappointment. Bella became the adult in their household, the one who checked that bills were paid and groceries were purchased and appointments were kept, the child taking care of the parent in ways that felt normal because she had never known any other dynamic. Her mother's friends commenting on how mature and responsible she was in tones that suggested admiration, but actually carried undertones of concern for a child who seemed to have no childhood at all. School was a place where Bella existed on the margins, too serious and too self-contained to make easy friendships with children her own age, who were concerned with games and social drama and the simple joys of being young and carefree. She was always in her own head, always reading or thinking or observing rather than participating, her natural introversion compounded by the adult responsibilities she carried and the sense that she was fundamentally different from her peers in ways she could not articulate but felt acutely every day. She preferred books to people, the worlds inside novels feeling safer and more comprehensible than the complicated social dynamics of playground and lunchroom. Her reading level advancing years beyond her age, while her social development remained stunted by lack of practice and lack of interest. The clumsiness that would define her physical existence emerged early and persisted stubbornly through childhood and adolescence. Bella tripping over flat surfaces and dropping things she was holding and walking into door frames with alarming regularity. Her body moving through space with a lack of grace that suggested her mind was always elsewhere, and her physical form was an afterthought she could not quite control or coordinate. She was not athletic, had no interest in sports or physical activities, preferred stillness and quiet to movement and noise in all circumstances. Teachers learned not to call on her in class unless they wanted mumbled responses delivered to the desk rather than to the room. Her intelligence obvious in her written work, but her verbal participation minimal and reluctant. Her relationship with her mother was complicated in ways Bella would not fully understand until she was much older. the deep love between them existing alongside Bella's protective instinct that was more maternal than filial. Her constant low-level worry about Renee's well-being and decision-making, creating stress that no child should carry. She loved her mother fiercely and completely, understood that Renee's chaos came from a genuine inability to function conventionally rather than from malice or neglect, recognized that her mother was doing her best even when her best was inadequate to the practical demands of raising a child alone. But she also resented sometimes the burden of being the responsible one, the weight of managing their household and their lives while still trying to be a child herself, the loneliness of having no one to depend on when she needed support or guidance or simple reassurance that everything would be fine. The summers in Forks began when Bella was young enough that the trips felt like adventures rather than obligations. 2 weeks every June when she would fly to Seattle, and Charlie would pick her up for the drive back to the small house on the reservation boundary, where he lived alone with his police radio and his television and his fishing equipment. Those early visits were marked by awkwardness and affection in equal measure. Father and daughter circling each other uncertainly, both aware they were strangers connected by biology but not by daily intimacy or shared experience, both trying desperately to bridge the gap that geography and divorce had created between them. Forks itself was Phoenix's opposite in every way imaginable, a tiny town on the western edge of the Olympic Peninsula, where rain fell 300 days a year, and the sun was a rumor rather than a constant presence, where the forest pressed close on all sides with towering trees that blocked the sky, and undergrowth so thick you could not see more than a few feet into the green darkness, where moss grew on everything, and the air smelled of wet earth and rotting vegetation, and the particular dampness that came from a place where nothing ever completely dried. The population was barely 3,000 people, most of them connected to the logging industry or the Quileute Reservation at La Push, everyone knowing everyone else's business, gossip spreading through the small community faster than any official news could travel. Charlie lived simply in his small 2-bedroom house, his life organized around his work as chief of police and his fishing trips to the rivers and streams that ran through the endless forest, his needs minimal and his habits unchanging year after year. He communicated primarily through grunts and nods, entire conversations happening with 12 words or fewer. His discomfort with verbal expression, making meals together, exercises in companionable silence, rather than the chatty exchanges Bella was accustomed to with her mother. But his love was evident in the way he prepared her room before each visit, buying new sheets or curtains he thought she might like, stocking the kitchen with foods he remembered her mentioning she enjoyed, clearing his schedule as much as possible to spend time with her, even though neither of them quite knew what to do with that time once they had it. Billy Black was Charlie's best friend, a Quileute man who lived on the reservation at La Push with his son Jacob and his twin daughters, his wife having died years earlier in an accident that nobody discussed in detail, but that hung over the Black household like permanent shadow. Billy and Charlie fished together most weekends, their friendship built on shared silence and shared interests rather than deep conversation or emotional intimacy, the kind of male friendship that required minimal maintenance but provided steady, reliable companionship. Billy used a wheelchair after an accident or illness that Bella never learned the details of. His mobility limited, but his personality filling any room he occupied. His laugh loud and genuine, and his stories about the reservation's history endless and entertaining. Jacob Black was Bella's summer friend from those early visits. The boy, who was a year and a half younger, but who grew tall early and always seemed physically confident in ways she could never achieve, who could fix engines and build things with his hands and move through the world with easy grace that made her own clumsiness even more pronounced by contrast. They played together on the beach at La Push during those childhood summers, building driftwood forts and searching for sea glass and skipping stones across the water, while their fathers fished nearby, their friendship uncomplicated by the social dynamics that made school friendship so difficult for Bella, the easy companionship of children who saw each other rarely enough, that every visit felt special rather than routine. The trips to Forks continued every summer through Bella's childhood. 2 weeks carved out of her Phoenix existence to spend in the green, wet world that was technically her birthplace, but felt completely foreign to someone raised under desert sun. She learned to tolerate the rain and the cold and the overwhelming presence of forest, pressing close on all sides. Learned to appreciate Charlie's silent affection and his efforts to connect with her despite his limitations. Learned to look forward to seeing Jacob and playing on the beach, even though the water was too cold for swimming and the sky was always grey rather than the brilliant blue she was accustomed to in Arizona. But when Bella was 14 years old, the summer visits stopped. She told Charlie that she wanted to stay in Phoenix that year, that she had summer school or a job or friends she did not want to leave, excuses that were transparent, but that Charlie accepted without argument, because he understood on some level that forcing a teenage girl to spend time with him would only breed resentment rather than affection. The real reason was more complicated and harder to articulate. Something about the awkwardness of adolescence making the already difficult visits feel impossible, her body changing and her social awareness increasing, and the gulf between her and her father seeming suddenly unbridgeable in ways it hadn't been when she was younger and less conscious of everything they did not share. The guilt about abandoning the Forks visits was immediate and persistent. Bella knowing that Charlie was hurt, even though he would never say so. That Billy probably made comments about daughters who forgot their fathers. That Jacob wondered why she stopped coming. She sent birthday cards and called on holidays and tried to maintain some connection through these minimal gestures, but the distance grew with each passing year. The phone calls becoming shorter and more stilted. Charlie's questions about her life answered in monosyllables that discouraged follow-up. Their relationship reduced to the bare minimum of contact that allowed them both to pretend they still knew each other at all. Renee met Phil Dwyer in the spring of 2004 when Bella was 16 years old and beginning her junior year of high school. The encounter happening at one of those minor league baseball games that Renee attended because she had decided that supporting local sports was her new interest, her latest attempt to engage with the Phoenix community in ways that might lead to friendships or at least regular social activities that did not require her to organize everything herself. Phil played third base for a team whose name Bella could never quite remember. a journeyman player in his late 20s who had spent his entire adult life moving between minor league teams in small cities across the southwestern United States, chasing a major league dream that was becoming less likely with each passing season, but that he could not quite bring himself to abandon entirely. The attraction between Renee and Phil was immediate and obvious, her mother's face lighting up in ways Bella had not seen in years, maybe ever, the happiness radiating from her so powerfully that even Bella's natural cynicism about her mother's enthusiasms could not entirely dismiss this as another passing phase that would fade within months. Phil was kind and patient, and genuinely seemed to adore Renee's chaos, rather than merely tolerating it, his own rootless existence making him compatible with her inability to stay settled or satisfied in any one place or situation for extended periods. They married quickly, within 6 months of meeting. Renee's impulsiveness for once leading to something that seemed likely to provide actual stability rather than simply creating new complications. But Phil's career meant constant travel. The minor league season running from April through September with games in different cities every few days. The players living out of hotels and team buses, their lives oriented entirely around the baseball schedule and the endless movement between towns that all looked basically identical from the perspective of someone passing through without ever actually stopping to live anywhere. Phil wanted Renee to travel with him, to follow the team and be present at games and share his nomadic existence, and Renee desperately wanted to go. Her desire to be with him obvious in every conversation about his upcoming road trips, her forced cheerfulness when he left for away games, not quite concealing her unhappiness at being left behind in Phoenix while he lived what sounded to her like an adventure. Bella watched her mother pretending that staying in Phoenix was what she wanted, that maintaining stability for Bella's final years of high school was more important than following her new husband around the minor league circuit. But the pretense was transparent and painful to witness. Renee had spent Bella's entire childhood being the flighty, irresponsible parent who could not manage basic household tasks. But now suddenly she was trying to be the mature, stable one who put her daughter's needs first, and the role did not suit her at all. The effort of maintaining it making her seem diminished and unhappy in ways that created guilt in Bella, that was crushing and constant and impossible to alleviate through any conversation they might have about the situation. The realization came gradually and then all at once. Bella understanding that she was the obstacle preventing her mother's happiness, that without a teenage daughter requiring stability and school enrollment and all the practical necessities of raising a child, Renee would be free to follow Phil and be happy in ways she could not be, while anchored to Phoenix by maternal obligation. The decision formed slowly over the autumn of 2004 and solidified into certainty by December. Bella recognizing that sacrificing herself was the obvious solution to everyone's unhappiness, that moving to Forks to live with Charlie would free Renee, while simultaneously alleviating some of the guilt Bella had carried for years about abandoning her father to his lonely existence in the rain. The conversation with Renee happened on a Saturday afternoon in early January of 2005. Bella bringing up the idea of moving to Forks with a casual tone that suggested she'd been thinking about it for a while and had decided it was what she wanted, rather than what she thought everyone else needed her to do. She framed it as desire to know Charlie better before college, as interest in experiencing somewhere different from Phoenix before she was technically an adult, and such moves would be entirely her own responsibility, as recognition that Phil and Renee deserved time together without a teenager complicating their newlywed period. Renee's protests were immediate and vocal and utterly unconvincing, her objections to the plan transparently half-hearted, her relief at the solution Bella was offering poorly concealed beneath her insistence that Bella should not sacrifice herself for her mother's happiness. But they both knew the decision was already made. Bella's mind set, and Renee's genuine relief at being freed from the impossible position of choosing between daughter and husband, making further argument pointless and unnecessarily prolonged. They called Charlie together that evening, Bella explaining that she wanted to come live with him for the remainder of high school. Charlie's surprise and pleasure evident even through his characteristic verbal economy. His simple, "that would be good," containing more emotion than Bella had heard from him in years of stilted phone conversations. He did not ask why she wanted to come, or whether Renee had agreed, or what had prompted this sudden change, simply accepted her stated desire and began immediately making plans for her arrival, his questions all practical ones about timing and what furniture her room would need and whether she would want her own car or could share the cruiser when he was not using it for work. The weeks between the decision and the actual move passed in a blur of packing and paperwork. Bella withdrawing from her Phoenix high school and enrolling in Forks High School, selling or donating most of her possessions because she understood instinctively that bringing too much would make the move feel temporary rather than permanent, and she needed Charlie to believe she was staying rather than simply visiting for an extended period. Her friends at school were surprised by her announcement that she was moving, though calling them friends was generous given that Bella had maintained her childhood pattern of existing on the social margins rather than building deep connections with her peers. They promised to stay in touch through email and phone calls, promises that Bella knew would fade within weeks of her departure, their relationships too shallow to sustain any real effort at long-distance maintenance. Saying goodbye to Phoenix meant saying goodbye to sun and heat, and the desert landscape that had been the backdrop for her entire conscious life. Bella realizing only, as she prepared to leave, how much she had taken for granted, the reliable warmth and the brilliant blue sky, and the way you could see for miles across flat terrain, unobstructed by trees or hills. She had complained about the heat through every summer of her childhood, had stayed inside with air conditioning running rather than enjoying the outdoors. But now, facing the prospect of the Olympic Peninsula's endless rain and grey skies, she felt something like grief for the son she was leaving behind and would not see reliably again for years if she stayed in Forks as long as she was planning. The goodbye with Renee at the airport was emotional in ways that surprised them both. Her mother crying and holding her and making Bella promise to call constantly and to come back if she was unhappy. The guilt about letting her daughter go warring visibly with relief at the freedom Bella's departure represented. Bella reassured her repeatedly that this was what she wanted, that Forks would be fine, that Charlie would take good care of her, lies and truth mixed together until neither of them could distinguish which parts were genuine and which were performance designed to make the separation easier for them both to bear. The flight to Seattle was unremarkable. 3 hours of reading and pretending to sleep and trying not to think about what she was doing or whether she had made terrible mistake that would define the rest of her high school experience and possibly her entire life. Charlie met her at the airport baggage claim, his uniform crisp, and his expression attempting casual pleasure, but achieving something closer to barely controlled joy at seeing his daughter arriving to stay with him permanently, rather than simply visiting for 2 weeks before disappearing back to Arizona. The drive from Seattle to Forks took nearly 4 hours, the landscape transforming gradually from urban sprawl to suburban development to rural farmland and finally to the dense forest that characterized the Olympic Peninsula, the trees growing taller and closer together, the sky darkening from overcast to truly grey, the rain beginning somewhere around Port Angeles and continuing steadily for the remainder of the journey. Charlie filled the silence with information about Forks and the house and school, his obvious nervousness making him more talkative than Bella had ever heard him. His desire to make her feel welcome and comfortable, apparent in every word, even though the practical details he was sharing were not particularly reassuring. He had bought her a truck, he announced with obvious pride, a 1953 Chevy that Billy Black had been keeping in his garage for years and had agreed to sell to Charlie for a price that was probably far below the vehicle's actual value. The transaction clearly motivated by friendship and desire to help rather than by any business sense. The truck was old but reliable, Charlie promised, and Billy's son Jacob had recently done some work on the engine to ensure it would run well for Bella. The mention of Jacob bringing memories of childhood summers and beach trips that felt impossibly distant from her current 17-year-old existence. The house in Forks was exactly as Bella remembered from her last visit 4 years earlier, small and slightly shabby in the way of buildings that received maintenance but not renovation, the white paint somewhat dingy and the porch boards creaking under their weight as they carried her luggage inside. Charlie had prepared her room with touching attention to what he imagined a teenage girl might want. New purple bedding and curtains, a desk he had refinished himself, a bookshelf waiting to be filled with whatever book she brought from Phoenix or acquired during her time in Forks. The room was small, and the window looked out on the forest pressing close behind the house. But it was hers, and it was clear Charlie had tried hard to make it welcoming, his effort more meaningful than the actual results. The truck was parked in the driveway, ancient and loud and somehow perfect, the faded red paint and the rounded curves of its body giving it character that newer vehicles lacked entirely, the manual transmission and the lack of power steering marking it as genuinely old rather than simply vintage styled. Bella loved it immediately and completely, understanding that this truck represented independence and mobility, and Charlie's desire to give her something that would make living in Forks more bearable by allowing her to escape whenever she needed space or solitude. She hugged him in a rare moment of physical affection, his surprise and pleasure at her enthusiasm making the gesture less awkward than their usual carefully maintained distance might have predicted. The first days in Forks were exercises in adjustment and culture shock. Bella learning to dress in layers against cold that felt unnatural after 17 years in Phoenix. Learning to accept that rain was default weather rather than occasional anomaly. Learning to navigate a town where everyone knew everyone, and her arrival was noteworthy news that spread through the community within hours. Charlie introduced her to neighbors and co-workers with obvious pride. His daughter, who had come to live with him, presented as achievement rather than simply fact. His pleasure at her presence something he could not entirely hide despite his usual stoic reserve. Forks High School loomed ahead as both inevitability and source of intense anxiety. Bella dreading the attention that being new student in tiny school would bring, understanding that in a class of only 60 students, her arrival would be major event rather than barely noticed addition. She had 1 week to settle in before school started. 1 week to learn the town and steel herself for the social ordeal that awaited. 1 week to convince herself that moving to Forks had been right decision rather than self-destructive impulse that she would regret for the remaining 18 months until graduation freed her to leave and never return. Bella's first day at Forks High School arrived on a Monday in mid-January of 2005, with the inevitable rain falling steadily and the temperature hovering just above freezing, the kind of wet cold that penetrated clothing and settled into bones in ways that dry desert cold never achieved, making her miss Phoenix with an intensity that felt almost physical in its sharpness and its persistence. The school itself was a collection of small buildings painted maroon and arranged around what passed for a campus, the lack of a single centralized structure giving it the feel of a community college rather than a high school. The narrow covered walkways between buildings doing little to prevent students from getting soaked during the brief transitions between classes. The attention began immediately. Every student in the parking lot turning to watch as she pulled her ancient truck into a space and killed the thunderous engine. Their stares open and curious rather than hostile, but still overwhelming to someone who had spent years cultivating invisibility in Phoenix's much larger schools. She addressed carefully that morning in what she hoped was appropriately Pacific Northwest casual. Jeans and a sweater and a raincoat that was already proving inadequate against the persistent drizzle. Her hair, pulled back in a ponytail that would frizz hopelessly in the humidity, but at least started the day under some semblance of control. The office staff were friendly to the point of overwhelming, the secretary greeting her by name and presenting her with a map of the campus and her class schedule, and a slip for each teacher to sign confirming her attendance. Their small town warmth, something Bella had not anticipated and did not quite know how to reciprocate appropriately. Her classes were mostly continuations of subjects she had been taking in Phoenix, the Forks curriculum apparently similar enough that she would not need to repeat anything or make up significant ground, though the teachers seemed less rigorous and the other students less driven than what she was accustomed to in Arizona's larger, more competitive educational environment. The other students introduced themselves with an eagerness that suggested genuine friendliness rather than simple curiosity, though Bella suspected the novelty of a new student in a school this small was a significant part of their interest. Jessica Stanley attached herself to Bella immediately, a girl with curly dark hair and a tendency toward chattiness that filled every silence with commentary about teachers and students and social dynamics. Her running narration of Forks High School's various dramas and relationships, providing more information than Bella wanted or needed, but that Jessica seemed compelled to share regardless of whether anyone had asked. Mike Newton appeared next, a boy with pale blonde hair and an easy smile who made his interest in Bella obvious within minutes of meeting her, his attention flattering and uncomfortable in equal measure. His assumption that they would become close friends or possibly more seeming premature, given they had exchanged perhaps 3 sentences. Angela Weber was quieter and seemed genuinely kind rather than simply nosy, her tall frame and her gentle manner making her the most tolerable of Bella's new acquaintances. Someone who asked questions that suggested actual interest in Bella as person, rather than simply desire to gather information for later gossip. Eric Yorkie was awkward and eager, his interest in Bella apparent, but less aggressive than Mike's. His role as school newspaper photographer, giving him excuse to document her first day with a determination that felt invasive, despite his obvious harmlessness. Tyler Crowley and several others whose names Bella immediately forgot completed the group that surrounded her between classes and at lunch, their collective friendliness overwhelming to someone accustomed to eating alone with a book. The cafeteria was small and loud, the tables arranged in rows rather than the circular pattern Bella was used to, the food recognizable as standard institutional fare that looked exactly like what every American high school served regardless of region or budget. Jessica guided Bella to a table already occupied by Angela and several others, the seating arrangement apparently predetermined by years of habit and social hierarchy that Bella had no context for understanding or navigating. She was answering Jessica's endless questions about Phoenix and why she had moved to Forks when she saw them for the first time. And the question Jessica had been asking died half-formed because Bella's attention had been completely captured by the 5 people entering the cafeteria together. They were beautiful in ways that transcended normal human attractiveness. Each of them possessed of the kind of perfect features and graceful movement that belonged in magazines or movies rather than a small-town high school cafeteria in rural Washington. They moved together as unit, clearly connected despite their different appearances, clearly separate from the rest of the student body by something more than simple physical beauty or wealth or social status. The tall blonde girl was stunning in ways that made Bella's breath catch, her features so perfect they seemed almost unreal, her body model thin, but somehow suggesting strength rather than fragility. The large, dark-haired boy beside her was massive, his shoulders broad, and his arms thick with muscle that strained against his shirt, his size suggesting football player or wrestler, except his face was too beautiful, and his movements too graceful for such rough sports. The small, dark-haired girl was pixie-like, her short black hair standing up in carefully arranged spikes, her delicate features and tiny frame making her seem almost childlike, except for the sophistication in her movement and her clothing. The honey blonde boy beside her looked pained, his body held with tension that suggested discomfort or illness, his eyes wary and his posture defensive despite being surrounded by his apparent family. And then there was the last one, the bronze-haired boy who sat slightly apart, even while remaining part of their group, whose face was so perfect that Bella found herself staring despite knowing it was rude and obvious, whose expression suggested both arrogance and vulnerability in ways that seemed contradictory, but somehow made him more compelling rather than less. Jessica's voice cut through Bella's observation, explaining without prompting, because she had clearly seen this reaction from new students before, and enjoyed being the one to provide context and information. They were the Cullens, she said. Well, the Hales and the Cullens technically, all of them adopted by Dr. Cullen and his wife, who had moved to Forks a few years earlier, the doctor working at the hospital in town and apparently being brilliant and charitable, and exactly the kind of medical professional a small community desperately needed. The blonde girl was Rosalie Hale, and the big dark-haired boy was Emmett Cullen, and they were together like a couple, which was weird because they lived together, but apparently it was okay because they were not actually related by blood. The small, dark-haired girl was Alice Cullen, and the honey blonde boy was Jasper Hale, and they were together too. Same situation of living together, but dating, which seemed strange. But everyone had gotten used to it. And the bronze-haired one, Jessica continued with particular emphasis, was Edward Cullen, and he was single and apparently uninterested in dating anyone at Forks High School, despite every girl's best efforts to attract his attention over the past 2 years. He was brilliant and beautiful and completely unattainable, Jessica said with a sigh that suggested she had personally tested that unavailability and found it frustratingly absolute. Bella asked questions about them that she tried to make sound casual, but that probably revealed exactly how fascinated she was. Learning that they kept to themselves mostly, that the Cullen kids were all adopted, and the Hale kids were foster children, though all of them now carried the Cullen name, that Dr. Cullen was young and handsome, and that his wife never came to town, but was reportedly very beautiful, that the family was wealthy and mysterious, and the subject of endless speculation and gossip that went nowhere because they never provided any real information about themselves beyond the basic facts everyone already knew. Biology class 4th period was Bella's first real test of her composure and her ability to maintain the invisible profile she preferred. The teacher, Mr. Banner, checking her slip and directing her to the only empty seat in the room, which was of course at a blacktop lab table next to Edward Cullen, who sat alone at a station clearly designed for 2 students. She walked toward the table with dread and anticipation mixed together in ways she could not separate or understand, aware of Edward's eyes tracking her movement, aware that sitting next to him for an hour every day would be either wonderful or torturous, depending on factors she could not yet determine. She slid onto the stool beside him and smiled tentatively, offering a quiet hello that he did not acknowledge or return, his body going rigid the moment she sat down, his hand coming up to cover his nose and mouth, as if her presence had introduced some terrible smell into his breathing space. His expression, when she glimpsed it, was hostile and repulsed. His eyes, which she now saw, were pure black rather than the gold or topaz she had observed from distance, narrowed and cold. His entire posture suggesting he was barely restraining himself from physically recoiling from her proximity. He leaned as far away from her as the small table would allow, his body angled toward the aisle rather than toward her, his tension so obvious that she could feel it radiating from him in waves that made the air between them feel charged and dangerous. The class period was torture. Bella, hyper-aware of Edward's continued rigidity and apparent disgust, her mind racing through possible explanations for his reaction and finding none that made sense or provided any comfort. Did she smell bad? She had showered that morning and used deodorant and had not done anything that would make her offensive to normal human senses. but his behavior suggested he found her presence physically repellent in ways that went beyond simple unfriendliness or disinterest. She tried to focus on Mr. Banner's lecture about cellular mitosis, but her attention kept drifting to Edward, to his white-knuckled grip on the edge of the table, to the way he held his breath for impossibly long periods before taking quick, shallow breaths that suggested he was trying to minimize his exposure to whatever about her was causing this extreme reaction. When the bell finally rang, Edward was gone. Before Bella had finished gathering her books, his speed startling and his departure so abrupt it seemed almost rude, except she was mostly relieved to have the horrible hour finished. She sat for a moment collecting herself, trying to understand what had just happened and why it had affected her so deeply when she barely knew this person and had no particular reason to care about his opinion of her. But she did care, she realized with dismay. His hostility had hurt in ways that seemed disproportionate to their complete lack of relationship or prior interaction. His beauty and his strangeness, and his immediate violent rejection of her creating an obsession that formed fully in that single terrible hour. Edward was absent for the entire following week, his seat in biology empty, and Bella's relief at not having to endure his presence again, mixed with disappointment that surprised her with its intensity and its irrationality. She asked Jessica casually whether Edward was sick or traveling, trying to make the question sound like simple curiosity rather than the obsessive interest it actually represented. Learning that no one knew where he was or when he would return, that the Cullens sometimes took trips without explanation, and that their absences were not questioned by teachers who seemed to give them unusual latitude about attendance and assignments. She found herself watching his siblings at lunch, trying to learn something about Edward through observation of Alice and Emmett and Jasper and Rosalie, noting that they seemed unconcerned about his absence, that they continued their isolated existence at their usual table without any sign that one of their family members was missing. They never ate anything, she noticed, pushing food around their trays without taking bites, their lunch period apparently social time rather than actual meal, their beauty and their strangeness making them fascinating subjects for Bella's covert observation, even though she knew staring was rude and would eventually be noticed and commented upon by Jessica or one of her other new acquaintances. When Edward returned after a week's absence, everything had changed. His eyes now golden topaz rather than black, his expression when he looked at Bella friendly rather than hostile. His entire demeanor transformed so completely that she wondered whether she had imagined or misinterpreted his initial reaction to her presence. He introduced himself as if they had never sat together, offering his hand for her to shake and smiling with warmth that seemed genuine. His apology for being rude the previous week delivered with charm that made her want to forgive him immediately, despite her lingering hurt and confusion about what had prompted his initial hostility. Their biology partnership developed quickly after that strange reset, Edward asking her questions about Phoenix and her family and her reasons for moving to Forks, his attention focused and intense in ways that made her feel like the most interesting person he had ever encountered. He was funny and intelligent and surprisingly easy to talk to, despite his formal manner of speaking that suggested someone much older than 17. His word choices and his references occasionally revealing knowledge or perspective that seemed inconsistent with being a high school junior in small-town Washington. The accident in the parking lot happened on a Thursday in late January, when ice had formed overnight on every surface, and the temperature had dropped below freezing for the first time since Bella's arrival in Forks. The black ice, invisible against the dark pavement, making the school parking lot treacherous for the students who moved too quickly toward their vehicles without watching their footing or the cars sliding on the slick surface. Bella had been standing beside her truck, talking to Eric about an assignment, when she heard the screaming and turned to see Tyler Crowley's van skidding sideways across the icy lot, directly toward her, the vehicle completely out of control. Tyler's panicked face visible through the windshield as he pumped brakes that were doing nothing to slow his momentum or change his trajectory. She stood frozen, watching the van approach with horrible inevitability, understanding that she was about to be crushed between Tyler's vehicle and her own truck, but unable to make her body move or respond or do anything except watch death approaching at 15 miles per hour. And then Edward was there, appearing from nowhere, his body somehow positioned between her and the van, despite having been standing 4 cars away when she last saw him seconds earlier, his hands catching the van's side panel and stopping its forward motion with a sound of shrieking metal that should have required a concrete barrier rather than human palms. The van left a dent where Edward's hand had been. The metal crumpled inward as if it had struck something immovable and unyielding. His other hand wrapped around Bella's waist, holding her upright and uninjured, while Tyler's van settled to a stop inches from where her legs would have been. The aftermath was chaos and confusion. Students screaming and teachers running and Tyler sobbing. Apologies while Bella stared at Edward in shock, trying to understand what had just happened and how he had moved so impossibly fast and stopped a moving vehicle with his bare hands. He was looking at her with an expression that mixed concern with frustration. His eyes, which had been golden that morning, now completely black again. His breathing rapid, though she could not understand why, given that he had not exerted himself in any way that should cause breathlessness. She asked him how he had gotten to her so fast, insisting that he had been nowhere near her when the van started sliding, demanding an explanation for what she had seen, because she was not imagining things and she was not confused, and she knew that what had happened was impossible according to normal human capabilities and limitations. Edward denied everything with increasing irritation, claiming he had been standing right beside her the whole time, insisting that her memory was confused by shock and adrenaline, growing visibly angry when she continued pressing for truth he refused to provide. The ambulance arrived, and the EMTs insisted on taking both Bella and Tyler to the hospital despite neither of them having visible injuries. Bella's protest that she was fine ignored by the paramedics who were following protocol about accidents and possible head trauma and liability concerns. Edward rode in the ambulance with them despite having no medical need for transport, his presence somehow accepted without question by the EMTs, who seemed to find nothing strange about a student who had been involved in the accident, but showed no signs of injury or distress accompanying the two who were actually being evaluated. The hospital was small and clean and staffed by people who clearly knew each other well. The emergency room more like a clinic than a true trauma center. the level of care adequate for a town this size, but nothing like what Bella would have found in Phoenix. Dr. Cullen appeared to examine her, and Bella understood immediately where Edward had gotten his impossible beauty. The doctor younger than she had expected, and so handsome it seemed almost unfair. His pale skin and his golden eyes and his gentle manner, making him seem more like an actor playing a doctor than an actual medical professional working in rural Washington. He checked her vital signs and asked about pain, and examined the back of her head where it had struck the ground when Edward pulled her away from the van, his touch cool and professional and somehow comforting, despite the strangeness of being examined by her classmate's father. Charlie arrived in his police uniform, his panic barely controlled, his relief at finding Bella uninjured so profound that he could not quite hide it beneath his usual stoic reserve. Tyler apologized repeatedly, his guilt and horror at having nearly killed someone making him almost incoherent, his parents hovering nearby, looking equally devastated and grateful that no one had been seriously hurt. Bella assured everyone she was fine, that the van had not actually hit her thanks to Edward's intervention, that she had no injuries beyond perhaps a small bump on her head that was not worth the fuss everyone was making. But she could not stop thinking about how Edward had gotten to her so impossibly fast, about the dent his hand had left in Tyler's van, about his categorical refusal to acknowledge what had actually happened, despite having dozens of witnesses who must have seen the same impossible things she had seen. Edward avoided her for days after the accident, his seat in biology occupied, but his attention fixed firmly away from her, his previous friendliness replaced by cold distance that hurt more than his initial hostility had, because now she knew what his attention felt like, and its absence was a loss she felt acutely. She tried to talk to him several times, approaching him after class or in the parking lot, but he walked away before she could say more than a few words, his rejection deliberate and pointed, his message clear that whatever friendship had been developing between them was finished, and she needed to stop pursuing answers he had no intention of providing. But Bella could not stop thinking about him or about what she had witnessed, her mind returning obsessively to the accident and to Edward's impossible speed and strength, her certainty that something was fundamentally wrong or different about Edward Cullen growing stronger, despite having no rational explanation for what that difference might be. She started researching online late at night in her room, searching for explanations of superhuman abilities and unusual strength and speed, her queries leading her down increasingly strange paths that included everything from genetic mutations to military experiments to folklore and mythology that she dismissed as ridiculous, even as she read through it with growing fascination. The trip to Port Angeles in early March was Jessica's idea, a girls' day shopping for prom dresses, even though Bella had no intention of attending prom and tried repeatedly to excuse herself from the expedition without success. Jessica and Angela insisted she come along, claiming she needed to get out of Forks and do something fun, their determination to include her in their activities touching, even though she would have much preferred staying home with a book. The drive to Port Angeles took an hour. The three of them crowded into Jessica's car, listening to music and talking about school and boys, Bella contributing minimally to the conversation, but appreciating the normalcy of the outing and the genuine friendliness both girls showed, despite her continued social awkwardness. The dress shop was small and crowded. Jessica and Angela trying on various options, while Bella sat and provided opinions when asked, her lack of interest in formal wear making her useless as shopping companion. But neither girl seemed to mind her minimal participation. After 2 hours of shopping, Bella excused herself to find a bookstore she had seen near the restaurant where they planned to have dinner, promising to meet them later. Her desire for solitude and books stronger than her willingness to watch more dress fittings. She found the bookstore and spent a pleasant 30 minutes browsing before realizing she had lost track of time and needed to head back to meet Jessica and Angela at the agreed upon location. The walk back should have been simple and safe. Port Angeles being a small city where crime was minimal and the downtown area generally well populated even in early evening. But Bella took a wrong turn somewhere and found herself in a less commercial area where the buildings were older and the streetlights fewer, the businesses closed or closing, the foot traffic minimal compared to the shopping district she had left. She realized she was lost and tried to retrace her steps, her poor sense of direction making the attempt unsuccessful. Her growing anxiety about being late to meet Jessica and Angela warring with her uncertainty about which direction would actually take her back to familiar territory. The men appeared from a bar doorway as she passed, 4 of them drunk or close to it, their attention fixing on her immediately, their comments starting crude and escalating quickly to threatening as they began following her down the darkening street. Bella walked faster, her heart pounding, understanding that she was in real danger but not knowing what to do about it. Given that running would show fear and possibly trigger pursuit while continuing to walk calmly was allowing them to get closer with each step. They were talking about what they wanted to do to her, their words making her skin crawl and her breathing quicken with panic that she was trying desperately to control and hide. And then the headlights swept across the scene, and a silver Volvo appeared from nowhere, the car pulling up beside her with the passenger door already opening, Edward's voice commanding her to get in with an urgency that made her obey without thinking or questioning. She threw herself into the passenger seat, and Edward accelerated away before she had even closed the door properly, his driving aggressive and fast, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that she heard the leather creaking under his fingers. He was furious, his rage palpable, his breathing harsh and his expression darker than she had ever seen it, his entire body radiating violence that seemed barely contained. He asked her if she was hurt, and she shook her head, unable to form words yet, still processing what had almost happened and what Edward's timely arrival had prevented. He asked where Jessica and Angela were, and Bella gave him directions to the restaurant in a shaky voice, watching as he seemed to struggle with some internal debate about whether to turn the car around and go back to find the men who had threatened her. She begged him not to, understanding somehow that if Edward confronted those men, something terrible would happen, that the violence she sensed in him was not metaphorical, but actual and deadly. He listened to her plea and continued driving toward the restaurant, but the tension did not leave his body. The fury did not fade from his expression. The restaurant was small and quiet, Italian food and dim lighting and checkered tablecloths, the kind of place that tried for romantic atmosphere on a budget that did not quite support the ambition. Edward insisted on buying her dinner despite her protests. his manners formal and old-fashioned in ways that would have seemed affected from anyone else, but from him felt natural and appropriate. They sat across from each other, and Bella found herself talking more than she had talked to anyone in years, answering his questions about her life and her family and her thoughts with an openness that surprised her. His attention focused entirely on her in ways that made her feel valued and interesting and worth knowing. She asked him how he had known where to find her, and he deflected, claiming he had been driving around looking for her after Jessica mentioned Bella had wandered off alone. She pressed him on how he had known she was in danger, and he deflected again, his refusal to provide straight answers frustrating, but also somehow expected given his pattern of avoiding any topic that might reveal too much about himself or his capabilities. She brought up the accident in the parking lot, insisting that she knew he had not been standing beside her when Tyler's van started sliding, demanding that he stop lying to her about what had really happened. Edward's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Bella to identify them all, settling finally on something like resignation mixed with frustration. He told her she was very observant, that most people would not have noticed the inconsistencies she had identified, that her refusal to accept easy explanations was both admirable and dangerous. He told her that he was not good for her, that she should stay away from him, that being near him put her in danger in ways she did not understand and could not prepare for or protect herself against. But even as he said these things, his actions contradicted his words, his attention remaining fixed on her, his obvious unwillingness to actually leave her alone, making his warnings seem hollow and performative. She asked him directly what he was, the question hanging between them with weight that made the air feel heavy and charged. He smiled without humor and told her that was the one question he could not answer, that some things were better left unknown, that her safety depended on her ignorance, even though her curiosity was going to make that ignorance impossible to maintain. They finished dinner, and he drove her back to where Jessica and Angela were waiting, both girls staring at Edward's expensive car, and at Bella with expressions that mixed surprise with speculation and barely suppressed excitement at having gossip to share with everyone at school the next day. Bella's 18th birthday arrived on September 13th of 2005. With a kind of inevitable dread that came from knowing celebration was planned, despite having explicitly requested none. Alice having announced weeks earlier that a party would happen at the Cullen house, regardless of Bella's protests, or her genuine discomfort with being the center of attention for any reason, but especially for something as meaningless as aging another year. The party itself was modest by Cullen standards, but still elaborate compared to anything Bella would have chosen for herself. The house decorated with white flowers and silver ribbons, presents wrapped in expensive paper stacked on a table in the corner. The family gathered to celebrate this human milestone with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested they understood how precious and fleeting human birthdays were given their own frozen immortal existence. Edward had been tense all day, his unease apparent to Bella, though she could not determine its source or understand why her birthday would make him uncomfortable beyond the usual vampire awkwardness around celebrations of human aging and mortality. He stayed close to her during the evening, his body positioned between her and Jasper, who seemed particularly tense himself. Alice's husband standing rigid near the windows, with an expression that suggested he was fighting some internal battle that required all his concentration and control. Bella opened presents with Alice's encouragement, trying to seem grateful and enthusiastic, despite her genuine wish that they had not done any of this, that she could have spent the evening quietly with Edward, rather than performing appreciation for gifts she had not wanted and attention she had not requested. The paper cut happened when she was opening a gift from Alice and Jasper, the edge of the wrapping paper slicing across her finger with a sharpness that drew blood immediately, a single drop welling up and spilling over before she could catch it or hide it or do anything to prevent what happened next. Jasper lunged at her with a snarl that sounded more animal than human, his careful control shattering completely at the scent of fresh human blood, his body moving with supernatural speed toward Bella, who stood frozen in shock and fear, watching death approach, wearing Jasper's face. Edward threw her backward with force meant to save her life, but that sent her crashing into the table, where glass and crystal shattered under her impact, the broken edges cutting her arm deeply, more blood flowing and making the situation exponentially worse as Jasper fought against Emmett and Alice's restraint, while Edward positioned himself between his brother and the girl whose blood was calling to every vampire in the room with varying degrees of intensity. Carlyle approached calmly and took control, sending Jasper outside with Alice to help him regain composure, clearing the others from the room until only he and Edward and Bella remained, the doctor examining her arm with professional detachment that seemed impossible given the circumstances and the temptation her bleeding must represent, even to someone with his centuries of practice and control. He stitched her arm with steady hands while Bella tried to minimize the incident, and Edward stood at the far side of the room radiating tension and self-recrimination and something darker that she could not quite identify, but that terrified her more than Jasper's attack had, because it suggested Edward was making decisions that would hurt her, in ways physical violence never could. The ride home was silent, Edward's expression closed and distant, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force, his entire demeanor suggesting he had retreated somewhere she could not follow or reach. Bella tried to talk to him about what had happened, trying to reassure him that she was fine and that Jasper's slip was understandable given the circumstances, and that no one blamed him or thought less of the family because of one moment of lost control. But Edward did not respond to her attempts at conversation, his silence absolute and somehow threatening, his walls rebuilding with visible effort that shut her out completely despite her desperate attempts to prevent the separation she could feel approaching with horrible inevitability. He asked to walk with her in the forest behind her house the next day, his request polite and formal in ways that made her stomach clench with dread. Understanding that this conversation would destroy something essential and irreplaceable, but unable to refuse because hope persisted despite all evidence that what came next would be devastating. They walked deep enough into the trees that the house disappeared from view, the forest closing around them with its usual claustrophobic density. The rain that had been falling all day creating a steady drip from the canopy overhead that matched the rhythm of Bella's accelerating heartbeat. Edward stopped walking and turned to face her with an expression that was carefully blank, his face showing none of the love or warmth or affection she had come to depend on over the past 8 months. his eyes, which had been golden that morning, now showing hints of black around the edges, suggesting he had not hunted recently or was under significant emotional strain. He told her he was leaving Forks, that his family was moving away, that Carlisle had received an offer from a hospital somewhere else that was too good to refuse. Bella's relief was immediate and overwhelming. Her fear that he was ending their relationship proving unfounded. Her willingness to follow him anywhere, making his announcement about moving away, seemed like minor inconvenience rather than actual problem. But then he told her she could not come with him, that this was goodbye, that their relationship had run its course and reached its natural ending point. The words did not make sense initially, Bella's brain refusing to process what he was saying because it contradicted everything she knew about their bond and his love and their plans for her transformation and their future together. She asked him to explain what he meant, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest, her need to understand warring with her growing certainty that understanding would only make the pain worse. Edward delivered his prepared speech with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed these lines, who had planned exactly what to say to achieve maximum effect with minimum opportunity for argument or negotiation. He told her he did not want her to come with him, emphasizing the word want in ways that made its meaning absolutely clear and completely devastating. He said she was not good for him, that she had been a distraction and an amusement, but nothing more substantial or lasting, that he had tired of pretending to be interested in her human concerns and her limited perspective and her fragile mortality. He said she did not belong in his world, that she had never belonged, that his family had tolerated her presence out of politeness, but would be relieved when she was no longer part of their lives. Bella listened to these lies because she understood they were lies even as they destroyed her, understanding that Edward believed he was protecting her by making her hate him, that his cruelty was intentional and designed to set her free from the danger his world represented. She begged him not to do this, her dignity abandoned in favor of desperate honesty, telling him she loved him and that she did not care about the danger and that she would rather die with him than live without him. But he was unmoved by her pleas, or perhaps more accurately was moved but determined not to show it, his resolution absolute despite whatever it was costing him to maintain this performance. He promised her that he would leave and that it would be as if he had never existed, that she would move on and have a normal human life and forget about vampires and the supernatural world entirely, that in time she would realize this ending was for the best and would thank him for having the strength to walk away when she could not. He told her not to do anything reckless or stupid, not to put herself in danger trying to get his attention or force his return, that he would not be watching and would not come back regardless of what she did or how much she suffered. And then he was gone, disappearing into the forest with supernatural speed, leaving her standing alone among the trees with rain falling and darkness approaching, and the absolute certainty that her life had just ended in every way that mattered. She tried to follow him, crashing through the undergrowth with no sense of direction or purpose beyond desperate need to catch him and make him take back his words and admit he still loved her. But the forest was vast and identical in every direction, and her human speed was pathetic compared to his supernatural movement. her inability to track him or determine which way he had gone making her pursuit futile and pathetic. She walked for hours as the light faded and the temperature dropped, her jacket inadequate against the cold, her shoes soaked through from puddles and mud, her body moving on autopilot, while her mind circled endlessly around Edward's words trying to find some interpretation that would make them less final or less devastating. Sam Yulee found her well after dark, the Quileute man somehow tracking her location despite the forest size and the complete absence of trail or landmarks. His gentle questions about whether she was hurt and whether she could walk receiving no response, because Bella had retreated somewhere deep inside herself where words could not reach. He carried her back to Charlie's house, where her father was frantic with worry. Police cruisers and search parties organizing to look for the chief's missing daughter. Charlie's relief at seeing her alive transformed quickly to fear when she did not respond to his questions or his touch. Her eyes open but not seeing. Her body present but her consciousness somewhere else entirely. The weeks and months that followed blurred together into undifferentiated misery that Bella experienced from a distance, her body moving through required activities while her mind remained stuck in that forest clearing, hearing Edward say he did not want her and watching him disappear into the trees. She attended school mechanically, her grades somehow maintaining themselves despite her complete lack of engagement with the material or the teachers, her presence in classes perfunctory and her participation non-existent. Jessica and Angela and Mike tried to reach her with invitations and questions and obvious concern, but she could not respond in ways that felt genuine or appropriate. Her social skills, which had never been strong, completely abandoning her in the face of grief too large to hide or explain. The night terrors began within days of Edward's departure. Bella waking screaming from nightmares she could not remember clearly, but that left her shaking and sobbing and unable to return to sleep despite Charlie's presence and his awkward attempts at comfort. He started sleeping on the floor outside her bedroom door, his paternal helplessness in the face of her suffering making him resort to simple physical proximity as the only comfort he could offer when words failed. And his daughter could not or would not explain what had happened or why Edward Cullen's family moving away had destroyed her so completely. Charlie considered sending her back to Renee in Florida, his concern for Bella's mental health outweighing his desire to keep his daughter with him, his growing certainty that she needed professional help, or at least her mother's presence making him research flights and schools in Jacksonville. But Bella begged him not to send her away, understanding somehow that leaving Forks would make Edward's absence final in ways she could not yet bear. That staying in the place where she had known him kept alive some irrational hope that he might return, or that she might find evidence he had existed at all beyond her memories and the physical reminders like photos that were mysteriously missing from her room. She discovered by accident in late October that reckless behavior brought Edward's voice back to her, his warnings and his concern and manifesting as auditory hallucinations when she put herself in danger. The sound of his voice in her head, worth any risk to her safety or well-being. She started seeking out dangerous situations deliberately, standing too close to the edge of cliffs at La Push, walking alone in areas of Forks she knew were unsafe, driving her truck too fast on icy roads, anything that might trigger the survival instinct that brought his voice warning her to be careful and to stop and to think about what she was doing. The motorcycles appeared in someone's trash pile in early January of 2006. 2 ruined dirt bikes that had been stripped for parts and discarded, their frames intact but their engines removed or destroyed, their potential for speed and danger obvious despite their current inoperable condition. Bella remembered Jacob Black and his mechanical aptitude, remembered childhood summers watching him fix boat motors and repair Billy's truck, understanding that if anyone could resurrect these bikes, it would be Charlie's best friend's son. She loaded them into her truck bed and drove to La Push without calling ahead, her plan forming as she drove to use Jacob's help rebuilding the bikes, and then to use the bikes themselves to generate enough danger that Edward's voice would return to her on a regular basis. Jacob answered the door, looking completely different from the boy she remembered from summers past, his growth spurt having added nearly a foot to his height and significant muscle to his frame. His long black hair cut short now, his entire appearance transformed from gangly child to something approaching adult male. His pleasure at seeing Bella was immediate and obvious, his smile genuine, and his enthusiasm about the motorcycle project making her feel something close to happiness for the first time in months. His presence warm and uncomplicated in ways that made her grief feel less suffocating and her existence feel less pointless. The garage at Billy Black's house became Bella's refuge through January and February of 2006. The small, cluttered space with its concrete floor and its collection of tools and spare parts representing the first place since Edward's departure, where she could exist without the crushing weight of grief, making every breath feel like effort she could barely sustain. Jacob worked on the motorcycles with patience and skill that seemed remarkable for someone only 16 years old. His natural mechanical aptitude allowing him to diagnose problems and devise solutions with minimal consultation of repair manuals or outside expertise. His enthusiasm for the project infectious enough that Bella found herself actually interested in the process rather than simply tolerating it as means to the dangerous end she was pursuing. They fell into easy companionship that surprised Bella with its comfort and its lack of complication. Jacob's presence warm and uncomplicated in ways that made hours pass without the constant awareness of pain and loss that characterized her existence everywhere else. He made her laugh with his stories about reservation life and his observations about people they both knew. His humor gentle and self-deprecating rather than mean-spirited. His obvious pleasure in her company creating space where she could be something close to her old self, rather than the hollow, grieving shell she had become in the months since Edward left. She told him about Phoenix and about Renee and about the strangeness of living with Charlie after so many years of minimal contact, editing carefully to avoid any mention of the Cullens or vampires or the supernatural world that had consumed and destroyed her. Jacob's devotion became apparent quickly. His 16-year-old heart laid bare in every look and gesture and word. His love for her obvious to anyone who observed them together, though Bella pretended not to notice, because acknowledging his feelings would require conversations she was not prepared to have about why she could not return them. He was kind and patient and everything good about humanity. His warmth literal as well as metaphorical, given that his body temperature seemed to run several degrees hotter than normal. His presence beside her on cold days in the unheated garage making the space feel comfortable despite the winter temperatures that should have required heavy jackets and constant movement to stay warm. Charlie was grateful for Jacob's friendship and its visible effect on Bella's mental state. His daughter returning from La Push with something resembling life in her eyes, rather than the dead flatness that had characterized her expression for months. He encouraged her visits to the reservation with an enthusiasm that would have been embarrassing if Bella had possessed enough emotional energy to feel embarrassment about anything. His obvious relief that she was recovering making him more talkative and more affectionate than he had been since her arrival in Forks. Billy Black watched the developing friendship with an expression that suggested concern mixed with resignation. His knowledge of the Cullens and their nature making him wary of Bella's connection to that world and worried about how Jacob's growing attachment to her might end. The motorcycles were completed by mid-February, both bikes functional and surprisingly fast given their age and their previous state of disrepair. Jacob's mechanical skills having transformed trash into dangerous but exhilarating machines that Bella immediately recognized would serve her purpose of generating enough adrenaline and risk to bring Edward's voice back into her consciousness. She insisted on riding immediately, despite having no experience with motorcycles and despite Jacob's reasonable protests that she should start slowly and practice basic skills before attempting anything dangerous, her recklessness alarming him, but also endearing in ways he could not quite articulate or resist. The first ride was exactly what Bella had hoped for, the speed and the danger and the very real possibility of serious injury, creating the conditions under which Edward's voice manifested in her mind, warning her to slow down and be careful and stop this immediately. She heard him clearly for the first time in months, his voice exactly as she remembered it, his concern genuine even though she understood rationally that this was hallucination rather than actual communication, that Edward was not watching her and did not know what she was doing and would not care even if he did know. But the illusion was enough. Hearing his voice made the ache in her chest feel less crushing and her existence feel less pointless. The brief moments of auditory hallucination worth any amount of physical danger or pain. Jacob taught her to ride with increasing concern, his worry about her safety warring with his pleasure at having excuse to spend time with her and to touch her when adjusting her position on the bike or demonstrating proper technique. She crashed repeatedly in the early weeks, accumulating bruises and scrapes that she hid from Charlie, but that Jacob saw and tended with gentle hands and expressions that mixed exasperation with affection. He begged her to be more careful, to slow down, to take the learning process seriously rather than treating every ride as opportunity for maximum risk and speed. But she could not explain why she needed the danger without revealing Edward's existence and his departure and the hallucinations that were the only remnant of their relationship she still possessed. The weeks of working on motorcycles and learning to ride transformed into friendship that Bella valued desperately, Jacob becoming essential to her continued functioning in ways she had not anticipated and could not have predicted when she first brought the ruined bikes to his garage. He was her lifeline to something resembling normalcy, his presence pulling her back from the edge of depression that threatened constantly to consume her entirely. His warmth and humor and uncomplicated affection, providing relief from the grief that characterized every moment she spent away from him. She understood that her need for him was somewhat selfish, that she was using his friendship to survive without being able to offer him the romantic relationship he clearly wanted. But she could not bring herself to end their time together, despite knowing she was probably hurting him by maintaining connection she could not deepen into what he hoped for. February gave way to early March, and Jacob began changing in ways that alarmed Bella, his already impressive height increasing further, his muscles developing with speed that seemed impossible without steroids or some other artificial enhancement, his entire physical presence transforming week by week into something larger and more powerful and somehow less boyish. His temperature seemed to climb higher, his body radiating heat that made standing close to him on cold days feel like standing near a furnace, his skin burning to the touch in ways that suggested fever, except he showed no signs of illness or discomfort. His mood shifted as well, periods of his usual warmth and humor interrupted by brooding silences and flashes of anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever had triggered them. His emotional volatility creating distance where their friendship had been characterized by easy compatibility. And then he stopped answering her phone calls and stopped coming to the door when she drove to La Push. His sudden, complete withdrawal, recreating the abandonment trauma of Edward's departure with horrible precision. Bella's fragile recovery collapsing as she lost her second anchor in less than 6 months. She called repeatedly and visited the house only to be turned away by Billy, who claimed Jacob was sick, but who would not provide details about his illness or when he might be well enough to see visitors, his evasiveness suggesting something more complicated than simple flu or cold was keeping Jacob away from her. She saw Jacob from a distance once, standing with Sam Yulee and several other young men from the reservation who had all undergone similar physical transformations, their group moving together with coordinated purpose that suggested pack mentality rather than simple friendship. Bella's confusion transformed into hurt and anger, her sense of betrayal acute because Jacob had been her salvation, and now he was gone without explanation or warning. His abandonment somehow worse than Edward's because she had trusted that human friendship would be safer and more stable than supernatural love. She confronted him at his house in late February, pushing past Billy's protests to find Jacob in his room, her anger giving her courage she would not normally possess to demand answers and explanations for his withdrawal and his obvious desire to be rid of her. Jacob looked pained by her presence, his new height making him tower over her in ways that emphasized how much he had changed in the weeks since she had last been allowed to see him, his eyes holding knowledge and burden that made him seem older than his 16 years. He told her they could not be friends anymore, that she needed to stay away from him, that being near him was dangerous in ways he could not explain, but that she needed to trust were real and serious. He mentioned Sam Yulee's name with bitterness that suggested resentment and fear mixed together. His implication that Sam's group, or gang, or whatever they were, had claimed Jacob in ways he had not wanted, but could not resist making Bella's anger shift toward Sam, rather than toward Jacob himself. She demanded to know what Sam had done to him, what control or influence Sam had that could make Jacob abandon their friendship, her accusations making Jacob flinch, but not making him reconsider his insistence that she leave and not return. The cliff diving happened in mid-March, during one of Bella's increasingly reckless attempts to generate enough danger to hear Edward's voice. Her observation of Sam Yuli's group jumping from the high cliffs at La Push into the churning ocean below, inspiring her to attempt the same feat alone and without considering the very real possibility of drowning or being dashed against rocks by the violent surf. She stood at the edge of the highest cliff, watching the grey water far below, the storm offshore creating waves that crashed against the rocks with force that should have discouraged anyone sane from jumping. Her desire to hear Edward's warning voice outweighing her survival instinct or her concern about the very real dangers of solo cliff diving in these conditions. She jumped without further hesitation, the fall seeming to last forever, the sensation of flying briefly exhilarating before she hit the water with impact that drove air from her lungs and disoriented her completely. The current was stronger than she had anticipated, pulling her down and away from shore. Her attempts to swim toward the surface hampered by inability to determine which direction was up and which was down in the churning darkness. Her lungs burned and her vision darkened at the edges, and she understood she was drowning, that this reckless attempt to hear Edward's voice was going to kill her, that she would die alone in the cold ocean, having accomplished nothing except making Charlie and Renee grieve her loss. And then strong arms grabbed her and pulled her upward with supernatural speed. Jacob's voice in her ear telling her to hold on and to trust him. His heat warming her even through the freezing water. His powerful swimming bringing them both to shore within seconds despite the current that had been dragging her steadily out to sea. He pulled her onto the rocky beach and held her while she coughed up seawater and shivered violently, his anger at her recklessness palpable, but outweighed by his obvious relief that he had reached her in time, that she was alive despite her best efforts to get herself killed through sheer stupidity and refusal to consider consequences. She asked him how he had known she was in trouble, and how he had reached her so quickly, her questions making him tense in ways that suggested she was approaching territory he could not discuss. But the near-death experience had stripped away his ability to maintain secrets and distance, his relief at her survival making him honest in ways he had been refusing to be for weeks. He told her he was a werewolf, or more accurately, a shapeshifter. His Quileute heritage carrying genetic capability for transformation that had been triggered by the Cullen's presence in Forks. The ancient treaty between his tribe and the Cold Ones creating obligation and power that bound him to supernatural world he had not chosen and did not want. The revelation should have shocked Bella, but instead felt like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Jacob's physical transformation and temperature increase, and Sam Yuli's pack suddenly making sense within context of supernatural reality she already knew existed. She asked questions that Jacob answered with mixture of relief at finally being able to tell her and concern about revealing tribal secrets to outsider. His explanation of the legends and the pack dynamics and the imprinting phenomenon providing context for the distance he had been forced to maintain. He told her about the pack mentality, the shared thoughts and memories that meant his private feelings and experiences were exposed to Sam and the others whenever he was in wolf form. His inability to keep secrets while shifted, making their friendship complicated in ways that went beyond simple treaty concerns. He explained that the pack had been watching for Victoria, the red-haired vampire who had returned to Forks territory seeking revenge for her mate's death. Her attempts to reach Bella blocked repeatedly by the wolves who patrolled the boundary line and who would destroy any vampire who crossed onto reservation land regardless of treaty or previous arrangements. Jacob's revelation that Victoria was actively hunting her should have terrified Bella, but instead felt almost validating. Proof that the supernatural world had not abandoned her entirely, even if Edward had. Confirmation that she still mattered enough to someone that they would seek revenge against her even months after the initial conflict had supposedly ended. Jacob's love for her remained obvious despite his transformation, and despite the complications his new nature created, his devotion unchanged by his new responsibilities to the pack or by the physical changes that had transformed him from gangly teenager into something powerful and dangerous and supernatural. He told her about imprinting, the phenomenon where shapeshifters sometimes bonded permanently to specific individuals with connection that overwrote all previous attachments and preferences. His obvious hope that he might imprint on Bella, making her understand that he was waiting for supernatural confirmation of what he already felt through simple human emotion. But he had not imprinted on her, and his choice to love her anyway felt both touching and somewhat tragic. His human heart choosing her, while his supernatural nature remained uncommitted and possibly waiting for someone else who would claim him with bond he could not resist or deny. Bella's feelings for Jacob were genuine but complicated. Her love for Edward still absolute despite his abandonment, her heart unable to transfer affection or romantic interest to Jacob, despite his obvious superiority in every practical sense. She loved Jacob, but she was not in love with him. The distinction crucial and painful and impossible to explain in ways that would not hurt him. Alice appeared at Charlie's house on a grey afternoon in late March of 2006. Her sudden presence in the living room, shocking Bella into paralysis before joy and rage warred for dominance in her emotional response to seeing Edward's sister after months of complete silence and absence. Alice's expression was stricken, her golden eyes wide with concern and relief mixed together in ways that suggested she had expected to find something terrible rather than Bella alive and relatively functional despite the months of grief and abandonment. She explained quickly that she had seen a vision of Bella cliff diving and then nothing, the blankness after the jump suggesting death to Alice's precognitive gift. Her immediate decision to come to Forks driven by need to comfort Charlie and confirm what her visions had shown her. Finding Bella alive confused and relieved Alice in equal measure. Her questions about the cliff diving and about why Bella would do something so reckless receiving answers that Bella tried to make sound reasonable, despite knowing that no explanation would justify solo diving in a storm. They were talking in the living room when the phone rang. Jacob calling to check on Bella after the near-drowning incident, his voice audible to Alice's supernatural hearing when Charlie answered and said that Bella was busy with a friend and could not come to the phone right now. Jacob asked where Charlie was when Bella was jumping off cliffs, his concern making him forget to be polite. His protective anger toward Bella's safety evident even through his brief exchange with her father. Alice's expression transformed to horror as she listened to Charlie's side of the conversation, understanding something that Bella could not immediately grasp, her hands covering her mouth as she pulled out her phone and dialed a number with shaking fingers. She spoke rapidly in Italian to someone on the other end. her panic evident despite the language barrier preventing Bella from understanding the specific words, her pleas and her obvious desperation making clear that something catastrophic had happened or was about to happen. When she ended the call, her face was ashen, her explanation tumbling out in fragments that Bella struggled to piece together into coherent narrative. Rosalie had called Edward to tell him about Alice's vision of Bella's death. His immediate response upon hearing that Bella had died being to seek his own death from the Volturi in Italy. Alice explained the Volturi quickly, the ancient vampire royalty who enforced their laws and maintained order among their kind. Aro and Marcus and Caius ruling from Volterra for millennia with power that made even Carlisle cautious and deferential. Edward's plan was to force the Volturi to execute him by exposing himself to humans in ways that violated their most fundamental law. His intention to walk into sunlight during a festival when the plaza would be crowded with tourists who would see his sparkling skin and report what they had witnessed. The flight to Italy happened in a blur of urgency and logistics. Alice driving to Seattle at speeds that should have been impossible. Their arrival at the airport followed by complicated negotiations to get them on the next flight to Florence with a connection that would get them to Volterra, hopefully, before Edward could execute his suicidal plan. Bella's panic was absolute, her guilt crushing as she understood that her reckless cliff diving had inadvertently caused Edward to believe she was dead and to seek death himself because he could not exist in a world where she did not. Alice tried to reassure her that they would reach him in time, that her visions showed them arriving before Edward stepped into the sunlight, but the futures were close and shifting, and Alice's confidence seemed fragile beneath her determined optimism. The flight was interminable. Bella unable to sleep or eat or think about anything except reaching Edward before he destroyed himself because of a misunderstanding about her death. They landed in Florence, and Alice immediately stole a yellow Porsche from the airport parking garage. Her justification that they would return it, eventually not addressing the actual theft, but suggesting that vampire ethics differed from human morality in situations where urgency outweighed legality. They drove through Tuscany at terrifying speeds, Alice's supernatural reflexes the only thing preventing fatal crashes, as she navigated narrow roads and tight villages that had been built centuries before automobiles existed. Volterra appeared on a hilltop in the distance, the medieval city walls and towers rising above the surrounding countryside. The same Marcus Day festival filling the streets with tourists wearing red robes in celebration of the vampire hunting saint, whose feast day coincided ironically with the actual vampire royalty living beneath the city in ancient chambers that predated the modern settlement. Alice parked illegally and they ran toward the plaza, pushing through crowds of celebrating tourists. Bella's human speed inadequate for the urgency despite Alice pulling her forward as quickly as possible without revealing their supernatural desperation to the humans surrounding them. They reached the plaza just as Edward stepped toward the sunlight, his intention to reveal himself to the crowd obvious in his movement and his expression. Bella screamed his name and threw herself forward, reaching him just as he moved into the light, her body colliding with his and pushing him back into shadow while the tourists around them continued celebrating without noticing the supernatural drama playing out in their midst. Edward stared at her in shock, his hands coming up to touch her face, as if confirming she was real rather than hallucination or ghost. His joy and confusion and the horror mixing together as he understood she was alive, but also now in terrible danger because the Volturi guard had certainly noticed the commotion and would come to investigate why Edward had not completed his planned exposure. The Volturi took them underground to the ancient throne room where Aro and Marcus and Caius held court. The massive chamber decorated with priceless art and lit by torches that created medieval atmosphere appropriate to the age of the vampires who ruled from here. Aro's fascination with Edward's mind-reading ability was evident as he touched Edward's hand and absorbed every thought and memory. His particular interest in Bella and her immunity to mental gifts making him insist on testing her himself by attempting to read her thoughts and finding only silence where he expected to access her consciousness completely. The Volturi's ultimatum was delivered with courteous finality. Bella must be transformed or destroyed. Humans who knew too much about their world could not be allowed to continue existing and spreading knowledge that might expose vampire existence to broader human awareness. Alice saved them by showing Aro her vision of Bella's future transformation, proof that the girl would become vampire, eventually making her current humanity a temporary condition rather than permanent security risk. Aro's acceptance of this evidence allowing them to leave with the understanding that the transformation must occur and that the Volturi would be watching to ensure compliance. Seattle's newspapers through April and May of 2006 reported an alarming string of disappearances and unsolved murders that human authorities attributed to a serial killer or possibly a gang operating in the city's less monitored neighborhoods. The victims, mostly young people, who vanished from streets and bars and were found days later if they were found at all. Their bodies displaying violence that forensic experts struggled to explain through conventional criminal pathology. The Cullens understood immediately what was happening. The pattern and the brutality consistent with newborn vampires feeding without restraint or caution. Victoria's plan becoming clear as Alice's visions showed fragments of an army being assembled for the specific purpose of overwhelming the Cullen family's defenses and reaching Bella to complete the revenge Victoria had been planning since James's death. The alliance between the Cullens and the Quileute Wolf Pack formed out of necessity despite centuries of enmity and mutual distrust. Both groups recognizing that Victoria's newborn army represented a threat large enough to require cooperation rather than competition. Bella's existence as the target creating common cause between vampires who wanted to protect her and werewolves whose treaty obligations and Jacob's personal devotion made her safety their responsibility as well. Jasper took charge of training sessions where he taught both vampires and wolves how to fight newborns. His experience in the Southern Vampire Wars making him uniquely qualified to explain newborn advantages and weaknesses. His demonstrations of combat techniques uncomfortable for everyone given the history he was revealing about his own violent past and the trauma that still haunted him, despite decades of distance from Maria and her armies. Alice's visions showed the battle approaching, but could not provide clear details about timing or Victoria's exact strategy. The red-haired vampire's erratic decision-making creating blind spots in Alice's precognitive sight that made planning difficult and uncertain. The strategy that emerged from multiple planning sessions involved hiding Bella away from the actual battlefield with Edward protecting her, while the rest of the family fought alongside the wolf pack in a clearing where Alice's visions showed the newborns would arrive expecting to find their target. Bella hated being sidelined and protected rather than allowed to participate or contribute, her human fragility making her a liability in combat, but her desire to be useful and to not be the passive damsel requiring rescue creating frustration that Edward understood but could not accommodate, given the very real danger the newborns represented. The night before the battle, Edward took Bella to a mountain campsite where she would wait with him while the fighting happened miles away. The freezing temperatures at altitude requiring Jacob's presence as well, to keep Bella from dying of hypothermia, given that Edward's cold body could not provide warmth and the sleeping bag alone proved inadequate against the dropping temperatures. The tent became a crucible where Edward and Jacob were forced into proximity and conversation, their mutual love for Bella and their rivalry for her affection creating tension that could not be entirely masked by their cooperation in keeping her alive through the freezing night. Jacob held Bella against his superheated body while Edward listened to Jacob's thoughts about loving her and imagining futures where she chose werewolf warmth over vampire cold, the torture of Edward's position evident in his strained voice when he spoke, and in his careful distance from Bella, despite his obvious desire to be the one holding her. The battle in the clearing happened exactly as Alice had foreseen, with the Cullens and the wolf pack destroying Victoria's newborn army through superior strategy and experience, Jasper's training proving effective as the Allied forces eliminated the newborns systematically despite being outnumbered. Victoria and Riley approached Bella's campsite as planned, the real attack happening away from the main battle where Victoria hoped to find Bella undefended or minimally protected. Edward and Seth Clearwater fought Victoria and Riley together, the young wolf proving himself capable, despite his age and inexperience. Edward's strategy and speed combined with Seth's raw power and enthusiasm, eventually destroying both vampires and ending Victoria's year-long quest for revenge against the girl who had survived James's hunt. The Volturi arrived after the battle ended, Jane leading a contingent to investigate the illegal newborn army and to determine whether the Cullens had been involved in its creation or had simply been defending themselves from Victoria's attack. Bree Tanner's surrender and her execution despite the Cullens' pleas for mercy demonstrated the Volturi's absolute authority and their rigid interpretation of laws that served their power rather than justice. Jane's disappointment at finding no legitimate reason to punish the Cullens, evident in her cold assessment of the situation and her implicit threats about future consequences if the family stepped outside their laws again. The Volturi's continued interest in Alice and Edward's gifts remained clear and threatening. Aro's desire to add them to his guard something that would require only the right opportunity or the right leverage to pursue actively rather than simply as abstract future possibility. Edward proposed to Bella properly after the battle ended and the immediate danger passed, his old-fashioned values requiring marriage before physical intimacy or transformation, his compromise with Bella's demands for change being that he would agree to transform her after they married, and after their honeymoon allowed them to be together as husband and wife before her humanity ended forever. Bella accepted despite her reservations about marriage as institution, understanding that this condition was non-negotiable for Edward, and that becoming his wife was small price for eternity together, and for the transformation she had wanted since the moment she understood what vampires were and what Edward was offering even when he claimed he wanted her to stay human. Alice began planning the wedding immediately with enthusiasm that overwhelmed Bella's protests, the party becoming Alice's project and her joy, her visions of the perfect ceremony driving her preparations with obsessive attention to detail that Bella tolerated, because making Alice happy felt like appropriate payment for everything the Cullens had done to protect her and accept her despite her humanity and her constant danger. The wedding preparations consumed the summer of 2006, with Alice orchestrating every detail with the precision and enthusiasm of someone who had been planning this celebration since the moment Bella first appeared in her visions years earlier. Her joy at finally being able to execute the perfect ceremony, making her immune to Bella's protests about excess or elaboration, or the sheer number of guests who would be attending what Bella had hoped would be a small, intimate gathering. Alice ordered flowers from 3 states away because the local options did not meet her exacting standards. She hired caterers from Seattle to provide food that the vampire guests would not eat, but that the human attendees would need. She designed Bella's dress herself with attention to detail, that transformed simple elegance into something worthy of a princess marrying her prince in a fairy tale that happened to involve supernatural creatures and immortality, rather than simple happily ever after. Bella submitted to the preparations with resignation that gradually transformed into something resembling acceptance, if not quite enthusiasm, understanding that this wedding mattered to Alice and to the Cullen family in ways that transcended simple celebration of Edward and Bella's union, that after years of isolation and hiding and pretending to be something they were not, the family wanted to mark this moment with beauty and joy, and public acknowledgement that they were claiming Bella as permanent member rather than temporary human attachment. She allowed Alice to manage her hair and makeup and clothing choices, trusting that Edward's sister understood fashion and presentation in ways Bella never would, grateful that someone cared enough about these details to ensure everything would be perfect, even though Bella herself remained fundamentally uncomfortable with being the center of attention for any reason. Charlie's feelings about the wedding were complicated and largely unspoken. His surface acceptance of Bella's decision to marry so young, masking deeper concerns about whether she was rushing into commitment she might regret, and whether Edward Cullen was truly appropriate match for his daughter despite the young man's obvious devotion and his family's respectability and wealth. He had tried once to have the father-daughter conversation about marriage and caution and taking time to be sure, his discomfort with emotional discussions making the attempt awkward and abbreviated, Bella's assurances that she knew what she was doing and that Edward was what she wanted ending the conversation, before Charlie could voice his real concerns about losing his daughter to a family he did not quite understand, and to a future that seemed to be taking her away from him permanently. Renee arrived from Florida days before the wedding with Phil in tow, her excitement about Bella's marriage genuine, despite her own failed first marriage to Charlie, and her awareness that 18 was very young to be making such permanent commitments. she pulled Bella aside for private conversation the night before the wedding, asking whether Bella was sure and whether she was pregnant, and whether there was any reason she felt rushed into this marriage rather than waiting until she was older and more certain about what she wanted from life. Bella assured her mother that she was not pregnant and that she was completely certain about Edward and about wanting to spend her life with him. The lies and truth mixing together in ways that made the conversation feel authentic, even though the real reasons for the wedding and its timing remained hidden beneath explanations that sounded reasonable to human ears. The wedding day itself arrived on August 13th, with weather that Alice had predicted weeks in advance would be perfect, the clouds breaking just enough to allow filtered sunlight without the direct brightness that would make the vampire guest's sparkling skin visible to human observers, the temperature mild enough for outdoor ceremony without being so warm that formal clothing would be uncomfortable. The Cullen house had been transformed into venue worthy of a magazine spread, white flowers and silk ribbons creating elegant atmosphere that made even the skeptical human guests understand why Alice had insisted on such elaborate preparations. The beauty of the setting matching the beauty of the family who had created it and who moved through the space with grace that suggested they belonged in such refined surroundings. Bella spent the morning in Alice's bathroom being prepared with attention that felt excessive, but that she had learned not to protest. Her hair styled in ways that looked effortless but required hours of work. Her makeup applied to enhance her features without making her look painted or artificial. The wedding dress fitting perfectly after weeks of alterations and adjustments that had tested Bella's patience, but that had resulted in garment that made her look elegant and beautiful in ways she had never achieved or attempted before. Alice stood back to admire her work with satisfaction that bordered on smugness, her vision of this moment having included every detail down to the exact shade of lipstick and the precise placement of the small crystal hairpins that held Bella's veil in place. Edward waited at the altar that had been constructed in the Cullens' backyard with expression that mixed joy with something close to disbelief. His century of existence having apparently not prepared him for the reality of marrying the human girl he loved despite having spent months planning for this exact moment. Carlyle stood beside him as best man with Emmett and Jasper flanking them. The three male Cullens in formal wear, looking like they had stepped from a fashion magazine rather than simply dressed for a wedding. Alice and Rosalie served as Bella's attendants, though she had not asked them to perform this role. Their presence beside her more Alice's vision of what the ceremony required than Bella's actual preference, but she appreciated the gesture and the symbolism of being claimed by the Cullen women, as well as by Edward specifically. Charlie walked Bella down the aisle with visible emotion that he tried to hide behind his usual stoic expression, his hand gripping hers tightly as if he could physically prevent her from leaving him by holding on hard enough, his eyes suspiciously bright when he placed her hand in Edward's and stepped back to sit with Renee in the front row. The ceremony itself was traditional and brief, the minister speaking words about love and commitment and partnership that felt both universal and specific to Bella and Edward's particular circumstances. Their vows exchanged with voices that carried enough emotion to make several human guests reach for tissues despite the brevity and simplicity of the promises they made to each other. The kiss that sealed their marriage was chased by necessity, given Edward's control and the human audience watching. But Bella felt the promise in it of intimacy to come, once they were alone and away from observers who could not know the full complexity of vampire-human physical relationship. The reception that followed was celebration that felt genuine despite the strangeness of vampires hosting party for mostly human guests. The food and music and dancing creating atmosphere of joy that transcended the supernatural elements lurking beneath the surface normalcy. Bella danced with Charlie, who told her gruffly that he loved her and wanted her to be happy. With Phil, who welcomed her to the family with sincerity that made her glad her mother had found someone kind. With Edward, who held her carefully and looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his existence. Jacob appeared late in the reception after Bella had assumed he would not come at all, his presence shocking her into tears that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. His gift of attending despite his pain at her choice, meaning more than any physical present could have conveyed. They danced together with her in her wedding dress and him in his formal clothes that looked uncomfortable on his large frame. Their friendship solid enough to survive her marriage to someone Jacob viewed as wrong for her and dangerous to her. His love strong enough to let her go, even though letting go was clearly destroying him. He told her to be happy and to call him if she ever needed anything. His voice rough with emotion he was not bothering to hide. His eyes holding knowledge that she was leaving humanity behind in ways that went beyond simple marriage to Edward. The moment that nearly destroyed the reception happened when Jacob learned about the honeymoon plans and realized that Bella and Edward would be physically intimate before her transformation. His rage at Edward for risking Bella's life during human-vampire sexual encounter, erupting into confrontation that required Sam's intervention to prevent Jacob from phasing and attacking Edward in front of all the human guests. Bella tried to calm Jacob down, but his fury was beyond her ability to manage. His protective instinct and his genuine terror that Edward would kill her accidentally during their wedding night, making him incapable of rational response to her reassurances that she knew the risks and accepted them willingly. Sam and the other wolves managed to remove Jacob before he could phase or cause scene. That would be impossible to explain to the human guests, but the incident cast shadow over the end of the reception that even Alice's determined cheerfulness could not entirely dispel. The departure for the honeymoon happened with rice and well wishes and celebration that felt bittersweet to Bella, as she understood she was leaving behind not just Fawkes and Charlie and her human friends, but her entire human existence. That when she returned to this place, she would be different in fundamental ways that could never be reversed or undone. Edward drove them to Seattle, where a private plane waited to take them to Rio de Janeiro, and then to Isle Esme, Carlisle's private island off the Brazilian coast, where they would have privacy and safety and time to be together without interference or observation or anything except each other, and the beginning of their forever. And so Bella Swan's human life ended where it had truly begun 18 months earlier, with Edward Cullen holding her hand and promising her forever. The ordinary girl from Phoenix who had walked into extraordinary darkness and chosen it willingly over every safe and sensible alternative her human existence might have offered. She sacrificed sun and warmth and her mother's daily presence, sacrificed normal college experiences and human milestones, and the simple, uncomplicated life Charlie had hoped she might build in Forks. She sacrificed Jacob's uncomplicated love and the safety of remaining human and mortal, sacrificed every future she might have had in favor of the one impossible future where she stood beside Edward as equal, rather than protected fragile thing requiring constant vigilance and care. Her human story was defined by choice and sacrifice and love that overwhelmed reason, by her willingness to walk toward death and call it destiny, by her certainty that some loves were worth any price and some forevers were worth choosing, even when choosing meant losing everything else. So rest now, gentle dreamers, with Bella standing at the threshold between human and vampire, between mortality and eternity, between the girl she had been and the woman she would become, her human life complete and her forever just beginning.